Hi, you are listening to Climatic Scale, a podcast about what it really takes to scale climate solutions. My name is Aneri Pradhan, host and co-founder of Climatic Group. And today I'm excited about our guest, Gideon Van Dyke, CEO of Chargetrip, who is scaling EV software in a fragmented infrastructure landscape. Welcome, Gideon.
Thank you very much. Hi, Aneri.
Absolutely. So for listeners new to Chargetrip, what is the problem you're solving?
Okay, so Chargetrip helps electric vehicle drivers find their next charge stop. And we've been doing that for the last 10 years. And we do that because we feel that buying an electric vehicle should be as good as driving one. And if you've ever driven an electric vehicle, that experience is amazing. But everything around it, there's so many shifting user experience paradigms to do with charging and where to charge this vehicle and how the charging works and if a station is going to be available and how to pay for charging and just how to get your family, let's say, from one point to another and have a really good driving and charging experience is not as intuitive as it used to be. And so we essentially exist to make that a lot easier for personal drivers, but also specifically for commercial electric vehicle drivers. And yeah, that's where we're at.
So why is this problem becoming more urgent? Because EV adoption is still not as high as we would like it to be in Europe. So what makes it more urgent?
So we really want as many people to adopt electric mobility as possible and as fast as possible. So you don't buy a lot of vehicles, about 1.7 in your lifetime on average. So we are really incentivized to make sure that your next vehicle is going to be electric. Obviously, that timeline looks a little bit different if you have a business, but even there, the write-off for a vehicle is anywhere from 8 to 12 years. So making sure that your next vehicle is going to be electric is very important. But if we want to make people move to electric mobility, we have to create the right conditions for them to adopt that technology. And I'm sure we have some shared interest in climate tech, and we were both part at some point of Elemental. So we understand really well how important it is that we are just very efficient with our resources and that we electrify as fast as possible. And so this is really a design thinking exercise, right? How do we get people to adopt this technology as fast as possible by making the whole experience around it as intuitive and seamless as possible? And that's really why Chargetrip exists. We want to take all the guesswork out of operating an electric vehicle. And a lot of that guesswork has to do with charging and with routing and with understanding where to charge and understanding how much you're going to pay and understanding what the impact is going to be of those shifting paradigms. For example, the TCO of your electrified fleet. And computers, or mathematics, is really good at solving for those complexities. And that's what Chargetrip does. You can think of us as a really big routing engine, specifically for battery electric vehicles, that predicts the amount of mechanical energy needed for a vehicle to go between 2 points. And on the basis of that intelligence, we can make all sorts of predictions about where you should stop the charge. And then if people start following those paths, we can start to influence that charging behavior. And that is very important for the industry. And it helps take the guesswork out of driving and charging and battery electric vehicle, which hopefully accelerates the advent of that sustainable transportation.
Amazing. And so you said you started 10 years ago. So that is a early.
That's a long narrative arc. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what led you to start it then? And what was the ecosystem like 10 years ago? And how does it compare now?
So it wasn't just me. We started with 4 friends, and we're all pretty upset with how cool electric mobility could be and how great it's felt to drive electric vehicles, but how difficult the entire experience was. Finding a charge station, understanding the different plug types, not knowing if you end up at a charge station whether or not you can charge, or really simple stuff like not being able to rely on the fact that there will be a bathroom, right? Which is such a big part of the assurance of driving, is that if you get gas, you can pee. This is like a very basic thing. And it, just to illustrate how much charging kind of changes about that movement experience. And so we were pretty upset that we're spending quite a bit of money on these vehicles of the future, but the experience around it was not really aligned. And so we wanted to fix that. And that was a long time ago. And if you are reading our early investor decks, we're predicting stuff that maybe happened 8 years into the future. So the electrification of mobility is taking a long time, and it's a very arduous process, and it's heavily influenced by regulation and incentives, and it's slow, but it's a very worthwhile industry to work in, and I'm still having a lot of fun doing it. But when someone congratulated me the other day with being around for 10 years, I wasn't exactly sure if that was a compliment.
Yeah, it's definitely a compliment.
It's a long time to spend on one of these topics, but I do think it is a very important one because we're going to need to move people and goods around, and we just need to make sure we do that as sustainably as we can.
Amazing. And I'm curious about your early tech and how spot on it ended up being in making your predictions. What did you get right or wrong about how fast this market would scale?
I think in general, we got all the thesis right about what the core value drivers are for electrification and how the value chain, what it looks like, and how that changes over time. It seems we got a lot of that right, but we got the timing very wrong. And I think we are still getting the timing wrong. And it's really hard to predict timing. And it's just EVs are very politicized in Europe, but in the US even more. And it's very hard to predict how policies change. And that really does affect timelines. So I think we got most of our core thesis around the user experience and around the value you can drive to charge point operators by directing traffic and how much you can optimize because the molecule is very volatile and stuff like that. The physiologies of this market we got really right, but the timing is just extremely hard to predict.
Yeah, that's true in a lot of industries, especially when you're also working B2B, which I know you're also B2B and B2C. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, your business model, and then who was your first real customer and probably an early adopter, I imagine, and what did you learn from them?
That's a nice question. There's a nice story about this. We're actually purely B2B. We do have some kind of community-driven applications that we keep around. If you ever want to play with routing for battery electric vehicles, you can go to go.chargetrip.com and you can play around with the technology. But we are really a B2B company. We sell our routing and our intelligence to other companies within the industry, whether that are OEMs that are building navigation into their vehicle dashboard, or whether it's charge point operators that have an app in which you can navigate to their stations and so on. We power that in the background. And then our first customer is actually still a customer today. So they've been with us for a very long time. But the setup changed a few times of how we work with them. But it was the Norwegian Elbilforeningen, which is the Norwegian EV Association. And it was an amazing first customer to have because Norway has always been a front runner when it comes to electrification. It was back then. I think currently they're only overtaken by China, but Norway was the hotbed of electrification in Europe. And when we first thought about a potential solution to help people figure out where to stop and charge their vehicles, the Norwegian EV Association was the first customer that adopted that technology. They were really excited about it. They wanted to give it to all their users. And so we went from having a sort of a pilot, a POC that we built ourselves, to 60,000 really engaged early adopters of battery electric vehicles using that technology every day. And then our servers crashed and all of that, the classical startup stuff happened. But we got really lucky because we learned so much from them. And they were extremely generous in giving us access to their users and giving us driver feedback and being patient with us as we were working through some of the early problems that we had. So that was an amazing customer to have. And they're still with us today. They switched apps, so they're now using a different provider for the application, but their drivers are still using our technology, which is very cool.
that. That's amazing. And it's so great to have a great case study. And the fact that your first customer is able to provide that first case study and champion it among their association is so cool. I'm wondering, can you explain maybe how exactly your platform worked for them and your other customers?
So our routing engine, you
Yeah.
can think of it as a really, I'm not sure what your background is, but if you did statistics or mathematics, this will be very familiar to you, but it's essentially a really big graph. It's like a spider web, and all the edges within this graph or all the strings are the street network, the global street network. And then the nodes are charging opportunities, charging stations. And then all of them carry weights. And then there's all sorts of clever heuristics. And there's essentially a cost function which looks at that graph and tries to prioritize the most advantageous charging opportunity for a vehicle. And another way of thinking about that is just as a routing engine from TomTom or Here or Apple Maps or Google Maps, where you go from A to B. And instead of giving it the fastest route based on traffic, this will give you the fastest route based on traffic, but also all these other impact variables, like the type of vehicle that you drive, what the consumption is for that specific vehicle, how you operate that vehicle. That makes a big difference with battery electric vehicles, but also the state of the battery, the health of the battery, the temperature, where the station is, whether it's available, if you're able to pay there. So this is quite a complex optimization, and there's lots of moving parts. Now, 8 years later, there's also dynamic pricing and all that kind of stuff that plays into it. So it's quite a big global optimization for travel time and energy consumption. And then our customers, they consume these routes through an API and they offer it to their customers, who is essentially the driver. Those could be personal drivers, but also commercial drivers.
And what KPIs matter most to your customers? Is it user retention, trip success rate, charging reliability, or something else?
So we found that it's very specific to the type of customer. So they all buy the same type of technology from us, which is just getting someone from A to B with charging in between, but it means something very different to them. So, for example, for a charge point operator who is trying to sell electrons next to the highway mostly, they want to increase the utilization at their stations. And then maybe secondarily, they might want to increase utilization at their partner stations. And because we capture so much of the battery electric vehicle drivers around Europe and now also starting to in the US, we can take that volume and steer it somewhere. So within this routing engine, there's all sorts of business rules that we can influence, where we might rank one charge point operator over another operator. And in that case, we steer more traffic. So it's about utilization. But then for, let's say, a fleet, it might be purely operational, right? They just want to optimize their TCO. So they want to make sure that for the tours that they know they're going to drive tomorrow, let's say you're a delivery company and you know you need to deliver these packages to these addresses, there's a big optimization that goes into figuring out where to go first and then second and third. But if it's a battery electric car, you want to make sure that you can either do that tour without having to charge. So that means the night before, you need to know how far to charge that vehicle. And the answer is not always to 100%, but probably to X percentage plus a margin. So you can charge another battery electric vehicle within that time window. And then during the tour, if you need to charge, you want to make sure that you charge at a station that's compatible with the vehicle, that's not too expensive, and so on. So depending on the customer type that we have, the core value driver is slightly different, but they all consume the same thing.
And what has been your biggest challenge in scaling Chargetrip so far?
I think it's timing. For us, we're really lucky with talent. I think we have a pretty incredible team. Most people have been there for a long time. We've got really good retention. For our last company retreat, I was doing the math, and 70% of us have been there for 6 years plus, which is a pretty good retention score. And that's because it's a really fun culture and it's really nice to work at. But it is really hard to figure out when to move with the market. So timing, just figuring out when to go into the US, for example, we got that really wrong. It's really expensive mistake to make. And of course, there's not much you can do about politics, right? This
Yeah.
is or NEVI funding being cut and all those sort of symptomatics of politics. But the result is that it was a very expensive mistake to scale too early into that geography or to scale into that geography. So getting timing right when there's just so many different moving parts is really hard.
No, I hear you on the timing, and I think, unfortunately, that's the one that is hard for us to control. Another issue with timing, too, is just sales cycles, especially B2B, for climate tech companies or energy tech companies, can take a very long time. So what does the typical sales cycle look like for your customers? I'm curious how it compares to some of the other solutions we featured on this podcast.
So I think, again, it really depends on the customer type. For this specific question, we could divvy up the customers between sort of new mobility, kind of startups and scale-ups that are moving into the space versus maybe the incumbents that have been within the energy space or the automotive space for a long time. They tend to have very long sales cycles. So we work a lot with automotive companies and also energy companies, but also incumbent leasing companies, for example. They're massive and they're big economies of scale, and getting through their procurement processes and even getting on their radar and starting to build sort of a knowledge sharing or like a shared value creation story with them is just harder. So I'd say probably 3 times as long as new mobility companies that are much more tech savvy, typically have their own engineering teams wanting to build something fast and don't have big procurement processes. I'd say they could get set up within at least 2 sprints, let's say a month to a month and a half. And then there's a contracting phase. So let's call it anywhere below half a year. And then for the bigger incumbents, it might take up to a year and maybe even longer. Yeah. And that's just the reality of those big procurement processes. And then there's always some sensitivity with navigation and knowing where drivers are. So you need to make sure that there's a lot of privacy in place and that we do this correct, that we have DPAs and so on, which also takes time.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. And that actually maps to also what I've heard in other climate tech solutions about a year.
Yeah.
What has surprised you the most about working with large mobility or automotive companies?
I think what surprised me the most is how little they know about e-mobility. So I think for a lot of these companies, they understand that we are transitioning to moving people and goods with batteries. But often for them, if I have a diesel van and I go to the dealer and I ask for an electric equivalent, then I should be able to do the exact same thing from an operational perspective. Now, that's of course not true. There's just a lot of inherent differences. Maybe I can illustrate that. So I know 2 good anecdotes about that. So one is a postal service that ordered like for like vans and then figured out that the battery takes up so much space that the cargo hold wasn't big enough to be able to drive the same tours they were driving with diesel vans, which seems like a silly mistake to make, but they bought the exact same van. So they expected the exact same cargo volume, but of course there's now a really big battery that needs to be somewhere. And then another example was a supermarket chain that bought a lot of electrified box truck or step vans, I think it was. And because they are now battery electric and they need to carry a really heavy battery, these batteries are big and heavy, these were a different weight class. So all the drivers needed to get an additional driving certification. So they had to retrain everyone. And so these are 2 quite silly examples, but I think the problem is often that there's just not enough knowledge yet about what all the paradigms are and how they are shifting. And that makes the adoption of electric mobility pretty tricky because moving goods, for example, is core to their business. And everything that touches their total cost of operations is just super scary and everyone gets super anxious about it. So if you then pair that with not a great understanding of what this new technology is and how it impacts the business, that can be pretty tricky to switch to and to get people on board with.
Yeah, that's a really good example. So you mentioned already a success pilot that you had with your first customer. What signals tells you if a customer is ready to scale, or are there ways to tell if they're just only interested in piloting?
So the way we look at if a market is ready is we look at the penetration of charge stations. This is a
Mm.
really good indication. Typically, there's a lot of investment in infrastructure before you see a lot of vehicles on the road. So if there's a high penetration of stations, and then of course we look at sales numbers of battery electric vehicles, it's a really good marker for us to go into a certain market. When it comes to a specific customer, I'm not so sure. I think that's a more difficult question. Our customers are pretty well aligned with electric mobility. So either it is an automotive that is transitioning their product towards an electric product, or it is someone that has been selling refueling but is now swapping out molecules and swapping out diesel for electrons. So they are really well aligned, I would say, with the product. I think typically when they engage with us, we are not the first entry point into electric mobility. We come because now they have an operational problem, and that's where we step in. I think we're a little bit later into the value chain,
Mm.
but we typically scale pretty well with our customers and always starts small because these fleets are smaller and then gradually grows.
Nice. And how important are partnerships in your growth with OEMs or charging networks or platforms?
I think for any type of startup or scale up, getting good logos on board is crucial, not just from a funding perspective, but also because companies look at one another and they think if this company is adopting technology X, then we should probably also follow. So there's a little bit of a domino effect there. I think that's probably the most important part. There's data partners that we really rely on that are extremely important to us because we use their data and we also supply them with data. And then gathering logos with customers is very important. For any type of startup or scale up, having a good logo book is important because there's a domino effect. Customers look at one another. And within e-mobility, as a sort of a larger vertical, you also see that, for example, within energy companies, if one launches a charging proposition, then another one will follow and also launch a charging proposition. So within the vertical, it's extremely important that there are good partnerships and that there's a lot of data sharing because it just means we can accelerate that transition.
And tell me about your next 12 to 24 months. What are your priorities?
We're going to focus quite a bit on commercial electrification, and that's quite a wide gamut of activities. So it includes rental and leasing. Both of them are electrifying really fast. The biggest electrified fleets in Europe are leasing fleets, and are much bigger than you might expect. So the two big leasers here, Avens and now the Leaseplan and Arval, they have around 800 to a million battery electric vehicles on the road today. It's a big number. And renters, it's the same. They're electrifying quite quickly. So we're building specific products for these types of categories. And then we're also seeing a lot of last mile delivery electrify. So we're also looking at specific product categories for those types of customers. And we're essentially really interested in the commercial vehicle market because it is such a massive part of our global emissions. Moving people is, of course, a big actor, but moving goods is where we can really make an impact. So this is a very exciting next 12 months because we're finally seeing the larger commercial battery electric vehicles come online, both, let's say, class 5 and up, but also heavy duty trucking, which is cool. So we're building specifically for those types of categories.
Nice. And if you could give one piece of advice to founders building in the EV or mobility software space today, what would it be?
Don't get in 10 years ago, but I'm assuming this is forward looking.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say try and have a really good think about geographies and timelines. If I would start Chargetrip again today, I think I would focus predominantly on commercial electrification. I'm very happy we went through our employer growth with personal vehicle owners because it taught us so much about the experience and what kind of features to build. But there is a good adoption rate now, and they are becoming more knowledgeable. And there is other navigation engines coming into our space. So I would focus on where we are needed most, which is commercial electrification. And there is some really interesting work to be done in the refueling part of this, because there's just so much anxiety about transitioning a fleet to an electric fleet, an ICE fleet to an electric fleet, just because it's such an important part of your TCO. It's 26 or 7% of your variable cost is just refueling. It's how you operate these vehicles. And there's so much you can do with optimization, specifically because this molecule is so volatile. Energy prices are just so much more volatile than diesel and petrol. And in the arbitrage for those costs, there's a lot of opportunity. So my advice would be to look specifically at that cost arbitrage.
Nice. And a fun question. What do you drive?
I have a Volkswagen ID.7 Station, which is, if not the first electric station wagon, then maybe the second or third. It was the first one that we could find, and it's 4 months old now, and I love it. The German automotives don't know how to make software, but the vehicles are incredible. The build quality is so good, and we can build our own software. So I think it's a really good car, and I've got 2 boys, so it's really important that we have a family car. I can recommend if you are looking.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you so much, Gideon. So for those who are listening, you can continue to tune in to episodes with industry leaders, startup leaders, and experts on climatic scale. You can find our other episodes on climaticgroup.substack.com, our website, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks again, Gideon.
Thank you so much.